Behind the net, centers, flat, tries to Clark, shot, oh, rebound, scores! It's for the game winner at 12 minutes and 1 second of Sunday.
Hey everybody, it's Isaiah, and I'm here with Chef B, who's going to tell us about one of our sponsors here. Chef?
Yeah, O&B Puckcast is now brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. The winter months can be especially hard on our homes, from roof damage and peeling siding to frozen pipes and toilet overflows. Call Summit Public Adjusters before you call your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be stressful and confusing. Let Summit Public Adjusters take the stress out of the claim process by having our guys work for you. Get the most for your money and your repairs. The next time the big snow or the rain leaves you with some home damage, contact us for a free consultation. Summit Public Adjusters are licensed in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Learn more at summitpublicadjusters.com or call 215-752-0560. Just tell them that the chef sent you.
Yeah, what was that number again, Chef?
215-752-0560.
That's terrific. All right, we're going to carry on with the rest of our show. And we are back. It is Isaiah. Welcome to the O&B Puckcast, episode number 172. The Flyers are at midseason or close, within 3 games. Close enough. And we got a lot to talk about because, midseason is a time of evaluation. The Flyers are coming off of 3 wins in a row, and they're the first Flyer team in history to ever sweep the California trip. That's great. Before that, they were 2-4-1, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, as we expected. But maybe, just maybe, what John Tortorella is trying to implement is starting to take hold a little bit. We'll discuss that, okay? The Flyers right now are 14-17-7, 35 points. They are, I could give you the regular standings, but nobody cares. Here's the standings that everybody cares about. They are 7th worst overall in the Bedard sweepstakes. So that means if the lottery held to form and you got the pick that you relative to where you finished, they would have pick number 7 in the upcoming entry draft. And we'll talk about what we've seen at the WJC with some draft eligibles and things like that. So let's get everything rolling. Just a reminder that as we introduce our panel, that Dan Silver, you can follow him at dsilver88 on Twitter, is at a poker tournament in AC right now as we speak. And he was featured in a local publication where they called us the O&D Puckcast, but it's okay. It's a local publication. Yeah, fire that guy. No, but tonight, so he will not be with us, but we do have always to my left, and his name is Chef B.
What's up, gentlemen? Looking forward to talking about some nice stuff for a change with the Flyers. A couple wins, 3 wins, some nice stuff. So it should be fun. Managed expectations should be the name of the episode.
That's right. And we'll dedicate it to Jason Martinez. Yeah, before we get rolling and introduce Kevin along here, I did want to remind people that the O&B Puckcast is on 12 podcast platforms, including Apple, Spotify, iHeart, TuneIn, Deezer, YouTube, and some obscure ones you might never have heard of. We also have a Facebook page. Plug O&B Puckcast into YouTube. Follow, subscribe, whatever is appropriate for your platform. And the reason why we ask you to do that, and of course there's never any charge, is it moves us up the charts when people are looking for Philadelphia Flyer podcasts, which of course is what we are. And we really have benefited from your support as we enter a new calendar year. Just hoping everybody had a great New Year holiday as we come back here, and just another thank you for everybody who has listened to us. So you can also follow us on social media at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck on Twitter. And we have a backup plan just in case there's an implosion somewhere. Getter, at O&B Puckcast, at O&B Puckcast on Getter, Gettr. And without any further ado, he's from 97.3 ESPN in South Jersey. He's a terrific guest. He's one of our favorites, and his name is Kevin Durso. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well, guys. Happy New Year to you. Happy New Year to everybody listening. It's great to be back.
Yeah, fantastic. The Flyers, there's a lot to talk about. I mean, the Flyers are having one of these interesting years where they're starting to see some things unfold and develop. There's two different things. Things are being revealed, and then there are things emerging, if you want to get into the subtlety of the language. And I think that has a lot to do with what we're going to concentrate on tonight. Just before, Kevin, before we get you to comment, I just wanted to give, it is midseason, a recap of just a couple of the highlights here, the top scorers. Travis Konecny leads the Flyers in goals with 19. That's followed up by Owen Tippett with 12. Kevin Hayes is tied in third place with Scott Lawton. They both have 9 in terms of points. Konecny has 37. Kevin Hayes, 32. Tony DeAngelo, 7 goals, 15 helpers, 22 points. The assist leader is Kevin Hayes at 20 with 23. Travis Konecny is the second with 18 apples, and Tony DeAngelo, as I just mentioned, has 15 helpers. So that's what's going on with the skaters. Carter Hart, he's played in 27 games. He's 10, 11, and 6, 289 goals against average, 911 save percentage, and a really interesting stat by way of Money Puck. And this is where you can see the hidden value of Carter Hart, is that he is number 7 overall in goals saved above expected. 12.8 goals have not gone in that probably should have gone in the judgment of those who figure out this metric. So number 7 in the entire league, and with a very important stat. And some of this has to do with John Tortorella, and some of this has to do with the player themselves. And we're going to leave it to Kevin to sort some of these numbers out and some other things, impressions you have in midseason with your Philadelphia Flyers.
Yeah, it's been an interesting couple of weeks, to say the least. I haven't really had the chance to talk about the team much in the last couple of weeks. There hasn't been many games. I remember doing for 97.3, we did State of the Teams, which airs on Christmas usually. So I recorded that right before the Carolina game that went into the break, and there wasn't a lot to go off of leading into that. They, kind of beat a couple, won a game against New Jersey that was a little bit of a surprise. That was the Carter Hart show again, kind of a typical theme of the season. And then they beat Columbus, which is kind of, okay, if we're going to go by the standings, a team they probably should beat, given Columbus's injuries, given where they are in the standings. And then, they had some kind of interesting games, Toronto and Carolina. They were trailing big. They managed to fight back. Both were 1-goal losses in regulation. Kind of the perfect formula to me for what everybody should be looking for this season. Competitive, not giving up, entertaining, but not getting the win, so they don't get the 2 points. They stay where everybody wants them to be in the standings kind of stuff. And then they've kind of gone on this road trip and found a way again. It's kind of been 3 really different games. You had the San Jose game that they had to fight back in that one. The LA game, I don't want to call it a fluky win because they battled the whole game, but the shorthanded goal through a screen kind of on just one that's thrown on net that proves to be the game winner. Those don't happen every day. So you take them where you get them. I'm sure, for Noah Cates, I'm sure he's thrilled with it because he's played well enough to deserve some points and hasn't been getting them. So that was huge for him. And then they really just dominated Anaheim completely. The thing to me that stands out about the last couple of games is that I kind of feel like we keep coming back to the same players that, I know certainly when I do the recaps for these games, I'm writing down the same names an awful lot. Travis Konecny's been simply outstanding during this last stretch of games. I think he's on a good point streak at this point for himself, and he's climbing. He kind of just keeps finding a way to score goals, even down to he was going to go pointless in the LA game, and he scores an empty netter that keeps the streak going. So he's in the middle of a lot of stuff right now. Scott Lawton's been really good. Noah Cates, as I mentioned, has been really good. Owen Tippett scoring goals with some regularity and starting to show some consistency in his game that's encouraging. You've seen a little bit more consistency production-wise anyway from Morgan Frost lately too. And you're starting to look for guys who stand out on a regular basis. Certainly Frost had a tough start to the year. He wasn't producing the way that everybody would like for him to, especially at this stage of his career. But he's starting to put a few good games together, and I think you've got to take those positives for now. But for the most part, I keep seeing a lot of the same things with, it's Konechny, it's Lawton, it's Cates, it's, D'Angelo, it's, Kevin Hayes kind of has cooled off a little bit since everything kind of went down with the benching and the scratching a little bit in terms of production. Did have a 2-point game the other night, so you take that for what it's worth. And, it just kind of seems like we're starting to get more and more clarity on the whole point of the season to John Tortorella anyway, which was who's with us, who's going to be part of this thing moving forward. And you're finding guys who you can certainly build around a little bit. I don't know if there's any game changer, but I think there's guys who are good talents that you can certainly say they're worth working with here and moving forward with.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a year we separate the wheat from the chaff. Chef?
One name you didn't, you might have mentioned it, but maybe I missed it. Farabee. He seems to be showing the last 2 or 3 games here a little more consistency of play. I mean, before we were seeing him, and it would always be a good game, then a down game, then a good game. Now the last 3, I guess this road trip, and if you look back, I guess it's kind of funny. Flyers have always looked to the West Coast in order to change their game around, their team around, or their certain players to come around. And it looks like, at least, just judging by my views, that Farabee's play is more consistent. Look like he might be on the other side of recovery from the neck. What have you guys seen?
I think he's coming around a little bit. And for me, I don't think we're going to see what he fully is out of this surgery until next season, to be honest. It's because it's just the way it's gone. Eichel was the same way. He's kind of continued to bounce back more to form, and Eichel's form is going to be on a different level than Farabee's. Farabee's never going to be what Jack Eichel is, or was in the early part of his career for that matter. But I have started to see it. He kind of I think he might have unlocked something when he finally scored a goal against Toronto. I think that probably was a big deal for him. And now he's starting to put a few games together where he's involved. Maybe he doesn't score, maybe he doesn't get any points, but he is more active and involved. It's kind of an on again, off again thing for me, because I've seen games where he looks very engaged, and I've seen games where, he could be more engaged. And I think it's just a tentative nature of coming out of the surgery. And I think that's probably what John Tortorella meant when he doesn't want him to, we're past the point of the surgery and the injury and all that type of stuff. I think that's probably what he meant, that, there's really no excuses per se. I mean, listen, Farabee's in charge of his own body, and I'm not going to try to speculate on how he's feeling on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
But you want to see him go, be the guy he was 2 seasons ago, last season even, a little bit more tenacious. I don't think he's quite there yet, but I do think that his production value is coming around, and that's kind of an important. That might be a huge, aspect for him, is if the production comes around, then you start to see that at least he's capable of getting back to what everybody was encouraged by, at least 20 goals a year, at least, 40, 50 points to start with. And maybe there's more of a ceiling beyond that. We really just haven't gotten the chance to see the complete ceiling of Joel Farabee yet, I don't think, because I think every time we've tried to, it's been some sort of crazy season that we don't get the full amount of games, or he doesn't get the full amount of games, or whatever the case may be. I think we really would like to see what his full ceiling is. And I don't know if we're going to get a full answer to that until after next season for sure. But I don't, he was already to me part of the future long-term anyway. I can't see how they would feel any reason to change things up for a guy that was just taken just a handful of years ago. And at least, for the most part, was one of the most encouraging players the team had for several years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the big question is, will Jack Eichel ever be what Tage Thompson is, right?
He's been incredible this year. He's been
30
incredible.
goals, right?
Yeah.
It's crazy. Hey, just a little side-by-side comparison. There were 2 players that were benched by John Tortorella earlier this year. And what was in the San Jose game? I think it was.
Yeah.
And one of them is Travis Konechny, who's on a pace to score 49 goals and with 46 helpers and 95 points. And the other is Kevin Hayes, who just only recently got out of a funk. It was definitely in the doghouse. And that's the kind of dichotomy here, the separation or the the sorting out that this season represents. Kevin, you've been down there. What's the atmosphere with that dynamic right now?
The building atmosphere is interesting to me because, I'm curious to see if anything is a little different now that they've been away for a couple weeks. It's hard to describe how this last road trip went because there's kind of an in-between. It's the 3 games on the West Coast. In total, it was a 5-game road trip, but let's be real, the break broke that up. They came home, they had some time. But that means it's been a long time since their last home game. It's been good, solid, almost 3 weeks since their last home game. They started to put together some better results. They've started to do some things. I know that some of the games recently, and the Columbus game wasn't going to be anything maybe to write home about, but when the Rangers were in town recently, that felt like a Rangers home game. And that was a scary thought. And they played the Devils at home 2 weeks earlier, and that felt like a Devils home game. So, you're starting that's kind of the tough part of the atmosphere. Is I do think that there are fans who are, Flyers fans who are coming down and I think are being genuinely entertained. I can't deny that. It's not like these games for the most part aren't close or aren't where the team is competitive. They've actually probably seldom played games this year where they've been really knocked out of it pretty early and down for the count and it's over by mid-second period. I don't think there's many games like that this year. But it's still hard for people to buy in when I don't know if there's, and I think the way I described it when I stated the teams on the station was, is there a guy on this team that people are going to sit there and say, I can relate to that guy, or I feel like I can get behind this guy for the long haul. I don't know if there's as many guys who are long haulers is probably the way to look at it at this point. I think everybody would love it if that was Carter Hart, but I think you have to wonder if that's the case, because how much longer in his career is he going to look at the state of the team also and decide, this is where I want to be. They have to turn it around quickly for him to be involved in that, I would think, because he's already gone through enough years. He's gone through a playoff run with them. I think you'd want to see some sort of direction where you're going to get back to that and you're going to have a shot, and think about all he's done in his entire career leading up to, I know we're going to get into this in a little while, but World Juniors are going on right now. Carter Hart's won a gold medal at World Juniors. He knows winning to an extent, and he knows winning on a big stage because we know how they treat that in Canada. If you win World Junior Championship and you're an 18-year-old kid who does it, you're royalty. You're right up there with everybody else. You're part of the lore of that nation. So I would say that's probably one of the things that makes the atmosphere tough is, who do you latch on to? Who do you say, this is the guy who I know I can back up for the long haul and will be around? And I don't know if there's a good answer to that right now. That's the hard part. I really can't sense that there's an answer. And I don't mean going into the prospect pool either. I don't think anybody's looking that far ahead, but I think if you're looking at the current, it's hard to find an answer.
Yeah, I think if there's an emergence right now of a player, it's Travis Konechny. And we've seen the ability, and we've seen signs that there could be seeds that are going to germinate and grow and turn into a really good player. And I think, we're having that. And I give John Tortorella a lot of credit for that. But like you're saying, that is the tough part of following this team with all the other below the radar stuff, their competitiveness and what you want to see on a night in, night out. That Chef, they are a better watch. You see that extra effort being made. You see the structure there. So when a player is in front of our net, there's going to be a stick there. Okay. The stick on puck is better. The fundamentals are better. The details are better. This is what you would expect from John Tortorella's team. And we're getting it. But is it enough to take the Flyers from number 4, or maybe even with the Union, number 5 in the city, to back up closer to the heights of where they've been anytime soon?
Well, that's a good question itself. And I think, man, if you know, to what Kevin said about the atmosphere down there, if you watch these games, the fans, they want to sit there, and between what the apathy that you've heard on Twitter, that you've seen on Twitter, on Facebook, all these other things of this team, they want to care. They really do. They want to sit there and turn around, and they want to sit there and say, that's my Flyers. They want to root for this team. You see them in these games. Before if the Flyers were losing by 2 goals going into the third, a lot of times this past year, you've seen that place empty out. Now you're seeing it because you don't know. They've come back so many times this year to at least tie it, force. Maybe they lose in overtime or lose in a shootout, but I'll be damned if they're not getting to these games and they're more competitive. And yes, I see that as that's going to be the biggest. That's the toughest issue. You just brought it up in 2 things. You both did. All right. How do you build this team based on a winning culture like he's doing? They're staying in games and still try to get enough out of a pick. You got to hope that your winning culture. I mean, you got what? TK, Frost, York, Farabee, Tippett. Okay, they're your and Cates. Let's throw Cates in there because let's not forget him. He's a big part of towards his future, I think. So you got those 6 players. Everybody's saying, well, you trade this person, you trade this. Now you're starting all over again. You need to start somewhere. Is it enough? What they have in that lineup? Now they might not be the best guys, and you're talking about getting other players coming up from this juniors and maybe from the draft or whatever somewhere down the line. So you got a 2-year window here. And like Kevin said, that's the biggest problem now. How do you hold on to these players through that time period? Because you have to build somewhere. Tanking is not a guarantee. But what is a guarantee is building a winning culture and a winning attitude that you're going to get from these players.
It's all part what this front office is going to have to handle. Let's talk about 2 things with the front office, something short-term that's come up, and that's Samuel Ursan. And his fine performance so far has created a positive dilemma for the Flyers front office. Before we move on to the big question, really, for me, for the rest of the season is what will the components of that front office be? But Samuel Ursan has looked as calm as you would expect any star goaltender, veteran goaltender to be. And Kevin, I think about that Carolina game you mentioned. The best thing John Tortorella could have ever done for Samuel Ursan is respect it. That was his first NHL game and get him out of there. Okay, I saw some people that disagree with that, and he should have let him take one for the team. Carter needs a rest. That's a whole other separate issue, whether Carter Hart needed a rest. Samuel Ursan has enough pedigree and enough going on that it makes sense to try and save his psyche. But when Carter Hart gets hurt, then there's a whole messaging problem with that we could get into a little bit. It's a soap opera, like we said last week. And then, Ursan has been on a little bit of a roll here. So then we have to think about, well, what's best for Samuel Ursan? What's best for Carter Hart? What's best for the organization if we want to develop Ursan, knowing he's going to need a lot of work? What's your take on all that?
Well, I was definitely impressed by him. I'll start with that, for not having a really good look at him because, his one full season in the minors, he was out for a lot of it. So there was really not a chance to get a good look at him. Preseason, I did a little, and he definitely, I agree with Tortorella. He was probably their best goalie because Carter Hart didn't play in the preseason. So, you got a good look at him then too. And I did think he was good, but among their best goaltenders, obviously. But, I understood why they sent him down because he hasn't had a lot of work. And I think you're just trying, very much take the Cam York approach with him, send him down, let him work. He'll be ready when the time comes. There was no doubt in my mind that time was going to come at some point. I was a little bit surprised that they were willing to give him the start. I kind of looked at the way that the structure of that 2-game little trip was and thought, that odd 2:00 start in Toronto may open the door for Tortorella to say, you know what, I don't have to give Carter Hart a break. We're off for the next 5 days, 6 days. He can play both. And instead, they actually did go to Ursan in the Carolina game. So I was a little surprised by that. And then he kind of comes out and it was that kind of game. He gives up a goal on his first shot faced and things like that. And he was having a night for sure. But, it's hard, listen, hindsight's 2020. When Carter Hart gets hurt, the easy thing to look back and say is, why'd you pull him? You could have avoided that. But, that's a whole nother story. It felt like it was a mercy pulling, just, it wasn't his fault that he was giving up the amount of goals that he was.
As a shooting gallery at that point.
Yeah.
Right. And you're trying to save him because, look, it's already a forgettable debut. I mean, it's unforgettable because it's your first NHL game. It's going to be unforgettable to you because you're getting shelled in that game, even though it's not your fault. So it is what it is. But to have to come back in, and Tortorella's talked about this a number of times at this point, about what he saw just in terms of having to go back into that game and then standing in there and actually being in there to give them a chance.
Yeah.
You know, they didn't have, looked like they didn't have much of a chance. And the next thing you know, they're back in the game. And he, you know, it's funny, he was off the hook for the result. You know, he doesn't take the loss in the end because he wasn't in there for the 6th goal. So funny enough how that works out. But then when everything kind of happened with Hart after that, when he wasn't able to go on, you know, when he was able to go on the trip but not able to play, and they had to give him starts, the calmness sets in for him. And I remember that being a good quality of his when he was playing in juniors. He had some World Junior games that, you know, you remember that being a big point for him, that he was able to be poised and do things like that. And he's shown it. You know, I really, look, he deserved a shutout the other night. He didn't get it by about 40 seconds, but you know, it doesn't matter. He still got the win, and he was playing, you know, he played well straight through the whole game. You know, it's easy to kind of let one slip by when it's 4-0 and you're down to the final 5 minutes left. He was still making big saves with, you know, 5-6 minutes left. So I've been impressed. I'm starting to wonder what happens next, because I don't see them carrying 3 goalies forever. You know, I think they will for the time being, but I don't see it happening forever. And I'm starting to think that he's shown enough in about 3 games time, 4 games, I guess, to catch the eye of John Tortorella with his poise, with his maturity in terms of how he's handling things, being a pro. And that's not meant to be a knock on Felix Sandstrom. I just think that the lack of playing time that Sandstrom's gotten may lead them to move him down and let Ersson play and continue to back up, because they maybe are so impressed by Ersson. That's kind of my read on it right now, because look, it's going to be really hard to send him back down after the 3 games he just had. You know, he won all 3. He stayed in there. It was, you know, he's doing everything right. And, you know, in situations where it didn't look all that different from when Carter Hart was in goal either, you know, when you're facing the shooting gallery, when you're in there against some high quality chances and you're still standing up to it and you're still finding a way to win some games, he's having the kind of start right now to his career that is probably enough to turn heads, at least in the short term, that they're going to, I would assume they're going to keep him up here. That's the way I see it at this point.
Interesting. Now, Chef, before I get to you, just 2 questions. The sticky part of this is that Ersson doesn't require waivers, so he's waiver exempt, and he can be sent down, so he could go back and forth without having to go through that. Sandstrom is, I believe, he's 26 now or something, and
25
age
still.
is. Oh, okay, but it's less important about his waiver status. He has to go through waivers, and they could lose him. And it's, you know, goaltending is a position that teams will take chances on, even if it's a long-term thing. Now, if you claim him at this stage of the season, Kevin, does Sandstrom have to stay on the roster a certain period of time? How does that work?
I think at that point in time, he'd have to stay on the roster. Yes, because it's similar. That's the normal case when it comes to these waiver claims. If you're going to try to send him down, then you have to pass him through waivers. It's very similar to, you know, when Kiefer Bellows ended up back on waivers. There was a lot of belief that maybe the Islanders would come right back and go, okay, we'll take him back now, thanks. And then at that point they could bury him in the minors. But it's, you know, it's tough to, you know, it's tough for the team that goes out there and looks at it. It's certainly an interesting dilemma, because, and that's why I kind of think that, you know, like I said, they won't carry 3 forever, but I don't see them making a move immediately, because I think that there's some time to wait this out. Maybe they look at it and they say, you know what, we can find a way to get Sandstrom into a game. If he looks just as good, they stick to what they've gotten and they worry about that later. You know, I'm sure that when the time comes, you know, it would be way easier to pass a guy like Sandstrom through waivers at the beginning of a season when most teams have their goaltending figured out than in the middle of a season when, if the right team has a vacancy somewhere, they're going to go and take him, because they're going to sit there and say, I can play this guy now, regardless of the record, regardless of the goals against and the save percentage. Those numbers, that goals against and save percentage number, are good enough for a team that may be urgently needing somebody who they feel is NHL quality to jump and say, we'll take him. And so that's the game that you have to play right now. And that would be the one case for Ersson going down. You know, I think that if I'm looking by performance, I think Ersson's more equipped to be the backup right now than Sandstrom is, based on what I've seen from both in small samples. I mean, Sandstrom's only played in 9 games himself this year, so it's kind of you're rapidly approaching equal samples kind of in a way, because there wasn't that much of a sample for Sandstrom either before Ersson got up here. So you're trying to weigh those two things and determine whether or not you want to take the chance on waivers with Sandstrom, or do you do the other thing, which is just retain your goaltending and keep the situation the way it is. And that would be the main case for Sandstrom to be the guy who stays, is the ability to keep all three, knowing you have complete control over Ersson, but you don't have that kind of control over Sandstrom.
Yeah.
Schiff, I'm sorry. I just one more thing I wanted to hammer out, because people are going to be thinking about this. 44 games left. Samuel Ersson is still a 20-year-old or a 21-year-old, and he's going to need 23. Okay, thanks for the correction there. He's still a developing goalie. He missed a lot of time. We've had crazy seasons. If with 44 games left, and Carter Hart is still your guy, can you play Samuel Ersson enough to help him continue to get better while not taking the shine off of Carter Hart? It's a balancing act.
I still think that there's a way to do it, because I know that the January schedule is going to start to have a lot of games pile up. The March schedule is very intense in terms of the number of games played. It's really only over the course of February, and then once you get to the end of the season, which by that point, even if you sent Ersson down and you didn't, did the thing to avoid waivers and Sandstrom's the one who stays, I still think you're going to eventually have a need for Ersson again somewhere down the road. I don't know who it's going to be, who's going to go down, but there have already been a couple of scares with Carter Hart. And I mean, he's obviously just had one that kept him out of a few games. He had taken a shot, and granted, it was admitted after the game it was just a stinger. It wasn't going to be anything that was going to linger, but he stayed down at the end of a win, making one last save, and you're starting to wonder, did he tweak something? Is this the workload? They have to be careful with him when it comes to the workload. You can't just look at the schedule and pretty much take for granted that the only time that the backup's ever getting in is every time there's a back-to-back on the schedule. You can't just do that. Obviously, I think an early case scenario where they can still squeeze out time for both guys, or however many guys, is if Carter Hart comes back and by all accounts he's going to play against Arizona on Thursday, then you've got the two games now, after the scheduling change, the two games back-to-back, Toronto, Buffalo. I absolutely see Ersson getting one of those games. Absolutely, without question. And then, you got another doubleheader, Boston, Anaheim the next week. I think Ersson could, if he's still up, would potentially get the Anaheim game there. Or even if it's not Ersson and it's Sandstrom, I can see Sandstrom getting the Anaheim game just because, so those are the kind of things that you keep an eye on in the early going. But yes, I think that's the balancing act you have to play. And with the amount of games that are left, you're trying to find what's a good number for the backup. It can't be one of these cases where with 44 to go, you're looking at 32 for Carter Hart and 12 for the other guy. And I don't know that it's going to play out that way anyway, because I really firmly believe that if that's what you think you're going to get out of Carter Hart for the rest of the year, then I think that at some point in time, an injury is going to pop up or something's going to pop up. I just have that feeling. It's a gut feeling, and that's the way that it is to me. But I look at that and I think there's probably room for majority of the guys, maybe all three, to find a way to get kind of almost an equal balance of the starts remaining if it plays out that way. And I'm certainly hoping that Carter Hart finishes a year healthy. The last 2 years, he hasn't been able to finish the year healthy. I hope that he does this time around. But, in the back of my mind, it's something that I'm kind of keeping in mind, that he has had to finish the last 2 years not playing because of an injury. And that could very well be the case again if you do what you're doing and run him into the ground, too much. I think that there's certainly because he's competitive too. He wants to play as much as possible, and we know that. But you just want to be careful with him, because he is without question the most important part to your future. And the one piece that I think everybody can agree on right now that you would hold on to, if you were able to turn this thing around in a year or two, he would be part of it. I think everybody can agree with that. So be careful with what you're doing with him just because of that nature. I don't think it turns around in a year or two, but just be careful. Yep,
absolutely. Chef?
Yeah, well, you guys kind of touched on most of it. I was going to talk about, how, he could slide Ersson down. But I will say this. From what I do remember, Kevin, you could correct me. from Ursan, he's one of those goalies, I think, from his way back when we first acquired him or drafted him. What I was reading that he was one of those goalies that has to be busy. Like he has to see a lot of shots in a game, play a lot of games. Do you think he's evolved out of that? And it seems like he's catching into a nice routine, even when he came in cold a couple times. That one game he had to come back in, and then he seemed to really settle into the third period of that game. And the other nights, I think it was like what? He didn't get like a lot of shots, but he made some very, very quality saves. So you think? I guess my question would be: Do people evolve out of their original molds? I guess, like in this case, where I'm saying yes, you can't hamper him in, even though he's still a young player. It hasn't quite evolved all the way, but it seemed like he made a significant jump in what he's done already, and that's a good sign.
Yeah, I do think it's possible. I think goalies is the goaltending position, and maybe I'm taking a little bit of a page out of John Tortorella's book here because I don't profess to know everything there is to know about goaltending, but I know that there is a lot of mentality that goes into it, and certainly I think that there's enough study being done now. There's a lot more. A lot more attention to detail about the way that a goalie plays. It's so much more less a style anymore than it is very precise kind of almost calculations in a goaltender's mind. Where do I need to be to make the save? That's how it's kind of evolved in terms of being active. The way I think, because I think Ersan kind of coming out of juniors and kind of coming out of the draft, and when he was drafted was described kind of as an athletic goaltender, kind of like that sense where he can do some things that are a little bit more acrobatic to a sense, but he does have the poise to just kind of stand in there. I see that he's kind of kept the calm demeanor, but I thought the one scenario that I thought was a really good one for him in terms of less action and kind of showing that evolution was the Anaheim game, because there wasn't a lot of shots going on in the early part of that third period, and it was an easy opportunity for him to kind of face one, especially, I believe they said by the end of the game, Trevor Zegras had 9 shots on goal.
9 shots, yes.
And he faced 29, so it gives you an idea of the percentage that Zegras took for Anaheim.
30% of the shots were coming from Zegras there.
But I think he took one somewhere, maybe 7 minutes into the third period, 8 minutes into the third period, something like that. And it's very easy for just the way that the way his release is, it could fool a goaltender who's got all of 3 games to his name in the NHL.
Yeah.
And just because it was one of the first ones he'd seen in the period, and it could have opened the door back up. I believe by that point that was before the Lawton goal that made it 4-0. So you could have had a 3-1 game with 12 minutes left, and it could change the dynamic of the game just like that. But he stayed in there and he kept making the saves. They kept making, they made a little bit of a push, and that's to be expected no matter what. But I thought that the other thing that kind of helps that is the team's play in front of him. He didn't get a lot of support in that Carolina game, but I think you slowly but surely saw him get more support, and as a result, it allows him to do his job a little bit easier and stay focused, and maybe face a shot that's not as difficult when he's not getting a lot of action in some of those periods. But I do think it is certainly something that a goalie can evolve out of. If you're that type of goaltender that needs a lot of work, I think you have to learn, especially at this level, you have to learn how to go with the ebbs and flows of the game, because it happens regularly. How many times in anybody's game do we see a stretch of, 5-10 minutes where a team goes without a shot and you're going, okay, this is just the way it is. And it happens to the best of the teams too. There's times where the best teams go long stretches without getting a shot on goal. And then because they have scoring talent, come down and score right away because of the fact that the goaltender's cold and they've got the talent. And that's why I think I look at that Zegras attempt so much for Ersan, because of the fact that it's a talented scoring type player, and he stood in there, made the save, and kept going like it was nothing. That's a good sign for where he's at.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at a talent of a goalie versus someone like Brian Elliott, and you say, well, this goalie such and such is better than Brian Elliott, but Brian Elliott can give you a similar performance playing 9 to 12 games a year, and that's what he's good at, and that's what they need him with when you have a horse like Vasilevsky. And Martin Jones has proven that he could turn his career around and deal with a variety of volume, and that in and of itself becomes something that a goaltender can offer even as a backup. So I guess the elephant in the room, I think, for Philadelphia Flyers fans is a period of time between now and the trade deadline where, let me just allude, Kevin, to Elliot Friedman and Jeff Marek making comments about the Flyers making a further break with their past. And when I heard it initially, I thought the way they were couching it and giving examples, I thought maybe some of the Flyers senior advisors might be going into, uh, uh, leaving the organization or taking even a lesser role. Like, I've never been one that felt like they were making important decisions day to day. I never bought that. But what I did buy is when they had to make a big decision on who would take over for Ron Hextall, they had a large voice. So in essence, indirectly or by proxy, they did have a voice and a lot of weight with where this franchise went from the time Ron Hextall left to where they're at now. So I thought maybe that's it. Or is it just the idea that they're going to finally admit that they're going to rebuild and they're going to make some structural changes with the front office to reflect that? I mean, what was your reaction, and what are you thinking about there?
There's a lot to unpack with that because, first of all, I'm in agreement with the idea that that's probably a necessary thing. And listen, as people, strictly as people, because these are people who are upstairs all the time where I am every time I'm at a game. I have the utmost respect for Bobby Clarke as a player and his place in Flyers history. But at some point in time, you don't want him to be part of the core group that makes the key decisions move going forward. You can have him show up every single night to the arena, walk around, shake hands with the fans, and be part of the history of this franchise like he is. He's a central figure, arguably the best player they've ever had. And, that's all well and good. But at some point in time, you do have to draw the line. And I think that the reason why it's so easy to do in this situation, like it's so easy to look at it this way, I should say, is, if people are immediately making reference to the fact that Chuck Fletcher got his first job in hockey because Bobby Clarke took a chance on him, right? Like, if you can connect the dots between certain angles of it, then you can kind of get the sense of where the involvement comes from, who had whom before, and what led them to believe that they were a good candidate for the job. It's just, I feel the same way about Chuck Fletcher that I do about Bobby Clarke in this scenario. Chuck's a nice guy. There's nothing wrong with saying a guy's a good person, but he's not doing his job to the level that I think he needs to do. I've been critical of it. A lot of other people have been critical of it. And, that's what it comes down to when, in the league, how many times we hear players talk about it's a business, it is a business. And these guys can be the nicest people on the planet. It doesn't mean, that they're going to do the job the right way or they're the right person for the job. So those are the tough decisions that need to be made. It's interesting to hear kind of this idea that there are any rumblings about the idea of that advisory group starting to potentially move on as well. I think that by now we've all heard for months now, we've heard about the potential of where Chuck Fletcher ends up, what's Chuck Fletcher's future, what's Danny Briere's future in all of this. We've heard about that for long enough. I don't think we've heard anything yet up until that about, oh, well, wait a minute, this could involve everybody. As much as I've talked about that in the past, and as much as some of my colleagues have talked about that in the past, I don't think we've actually heard anything that indicated that it might actually be something that would happen. I mean, the most recent thing that I've kind of come to terms with in the last couple of weeks, I guess, or several weeks leading up to, was the idea that, that it felt like there was, as much as everybody wants to hear that Chuck Fletcher's probably not part of this picture moving forward, is it possible that he just moves up and takes over the president role and Danny Briere's the GM? And I think we're all in agreement that would feel like a wrong move. It would be, that would just continue to make every move that's made, especially as the deadline approaches, associated with Chuck Fletcher anyway. He would be the president and Danny Briere would be the sit-in GM, if you will, that kind of gets his name on the press releases, but it doesn't mean he's necessarily the guy doing anything for that matter. He could be taking notes while Chuck Fletcher makes the decision. That's how it works. But that's the interesting part. And if you're going to go the former route there, if you're going to move on from Chuck Fletcher and you're going to take the other guys out of the equation for the next step, that sounds a lot more encouraging, that they aren't involved in the process, that they all take themselves out of that. and then it becomes a true outside search for a general manager or for a president of hockey operations. That changes the perspective, because now you're going to have to get somebody's outside perspective on what the team is. And I think that we all have a good sense of what people think around the league of the team. So that's the hard part. I do think that the interesting part about what you were asking also is the word rebuild. I don't think that the front office, the advisory group, anybody like that in years has had, think about the last time that this situation came up when Ron Hextall was let go, or even in the time when the transition period was made. I don't recall Peter Laviolette being a guy who was vocal about, he had a winning team anyway, so it's a little harder for him. But when things were going in different directions, or there was the possibility you could have to make a move that more or less indicates more rebuilding than it does current success, was Dave Haxtell going to step to the forefront and challenge the front office by speaking so directly about it? Absolutely not. You have a head coach in John Tortorella who just speaks his mind and doesn't have a filter. So when he says the word rebuild, a lot of people listen because of the fact that they're hearing from a guy who gives honest assessments all the time. And I think it has to put some emphasis on what the front office does from there, because the fact that now they have to look at it and go, well, what do we do now? The coach said this, it's kind of hard to move forward and just kind of gloss over everything when it's out there in the open like that. So that's the hard part. Are they building? Yeah, I believe that. And I've believed it for several years. It's a little bit of a unique way of building because it's not your traditional finish bottom three every year, and that makes it a longer and harder build, because you don't get a miracle worker right away. You don't get the guy who they popped into the National Hockey League straight out of a video game as Connor McDavid is, or Austin Matthews is, or, certainly when we get to the junior discussion that we're going to have what Connor Bedard is going to be, because there's zero doubt in my mind that that's what Connor Bedard is going to be. He's going to be a miracle worker for some franchise, and who knows who it's going to be, because you got to wait until the lottery to find that information out. But that's the hard part about building. If you're not going to have, the clear cut, take that approach and find a way to get to the miracle worker of the draft, the generational talent, the way I kind of look at it from the Flyers perspective, especially going back in history, is, and it's a guy we've talked about before. I think the last time I was on, Eric Lindros isn't walking through the door anytime soon as the highest touted prospect in hockey. They got the highest touted prospect in hockey at a downtime in the franchise. And what happened? He got eyeballs on it again. He turned it around, yep. And then he got support to go with it. And he was still the centerpiece, but he had support. And next thing you know, you've got one of the most dominant lines in hockey. That's how you build something. Usually somewhere along the line, you have to get somebody who's a game changer.
Yep, I agree. It's hard to argue. It's just that with the way they're going to structure this thing, if you're right, and what we're hearing, we've had some people on the last couple of shows dedicated to this very topic. There are people who believe that Chuck Fletcher will be like the Flyers version of Howie Roseman and Chip Kelly, where Chuck Fletcher will make announcements and he'll be almost like a titular head and the president. They'll give him duties that address some of the strengths he brings to the job, but not really so much hockey ops. He might have a voice, but it's kind of like, the Yiddish expression, schmierbissel. We give Chuck an opportunity to say something, but then put him back in the corner. Maybe that's going to happen. But without Danny Briere, what qualifies Danny Briere to be a GM? He hasn't even been a GM at the AHL level. He's not really officially an assistant GM. That's the worrisome part of this whole thing. This doesn't seem to bring with it a professional structure for running an NHL team in 2023. So, and who they're coming up on the trade deadline. Kevin, what do you think is the timing on this? Because there are decisions that have to be made with players like JVR and others that are going to be coming up, and some value judgments that need to be made with players that might have a particular kind of worth come trade deadline. It might be good to get rid of certain contracts that the team doesn't want to move forward with, even if it's not now. Like Kevin Hayes looks like a player who might not be here next year. Not that that would happen during the trade deadline, but even sowing the seeds for the offseason, these are big decisions and you can't take them lightly.
Yeah. And the timeline question is one that, I think we're going to be searching for answers for a little while at this point, because we talked at the quarter mark of the season that was pushing Thanksgiving, and the idea was, it's got to happen sooner or later. You're at that quarter mark. It feels like this is a time of year when everything goes down. If you're going to do these things, this is usually about when you do them. And then the thought process was that, I had heard some things about maybe closer to Christmas and the break hits, and okay, you're not going to do it right away on the break. Maybe even you're not going to do it when the whole team is away either. Like right now, I believe there's talk about how either Chuck Fletcher or somebody on his staff is doing a lot of things around the World Juniors, and you're going to let him fulfill that assignment, and then maybe something. I don't know. But the longer it goes, the more insecure I think fans get about it, because then you're starting to think about, is he going to have, is he going to have his fingerprints on another trade deadline? That's what you're starting to ask, starting to ask at this point. We're down to less than 2 months of this, to your point, there isn't anything that necessarily qualifies Danny Briere to be the guy. I do think he's more of an assistant than we realize. Even though the title may not say so, I do think he's involved in a few more decisions than we realize. But there's nothing that necessarily says he's going to be a good GM or not. I'll take the fact that he was high enough on the Montreal Canadiens list when they had a vacancy that somebody else, it's not just the Flyers that would be seeing this, somebody else did too. So I'll take some solace in that. But I also, if I'm being honest, I worry for the guy, not because I don't think he has the ability to be a smart enough guy to do the job. It's honestly, and I'm not saying this from a standpoint of like, don't ever do this, but it is his Flyers connection that actually kind of worries me. Not because it's, same old. It's, this guy was a fan favorite as a player. And who else was a fan favorite as a player? Ron Hextall. And he's hated now because, he wasn't the best GM, and he didn't do some of the right things, or didn't, make the best draft picks in the long run, or whatever the case may be, And I worry that, what would happen if Danny Briere had the same fate? Here's a guy who, by all accounts, if they brought him out, if they mentioned him that he's sitting in the crowd, he's in one of the suites somewhere, the place would go nuts because of 2010 and because of the playoff moments and all of that type of stuff. And I worry about that. If you were to give him the keys to the whole thing, if you were to say, this is your operation now, is he good enough to do the job and not necessarily ruin that reputation of being a fan favorite as a player and not being a good enough management person, to do that? Because we've mentioned enough former player names and former, pieces of this franchise's history that have had jobs like this, that it doesn't end the prettiest, regardless of what they did as a player, regardless of what place they had in history, because it's also about the here and now, and it's about keeping that tradition alive. So I worry about that for Danny Briere if he were to get the job. That said, I do think it's also hard the closer you get to the deadline to find anybody who's got any information that they can run with at the deadline. At least right now he's sitting in on meetings. He's getting an idea of who's a possible move. How do you lay the groundwork for somebody who maybe you don't move them at the deadline, but you're going to try to lay some groundwork for a move in the offseason, like a Kevin Hayes, maybe like somebody else who has more term that you're trying to move, whatever that may be. Maybe it's a defenseman, maybe it's another forward that we're thinking of here. That there's various candidates for this type of stuff. I think Danny Briere could step in and make a suitable trade for James and Riemsdyk. Like, I don't think that's as much of a challenge as it is, how do you fix the problem, which is the amount of guys with term and the amount of guys with cap hits that are pretty expensive given the landscape of things, and are you good enough to do all the other pieces of a building process, to draft players and then make sure they have the developmental tools to turn out what they're supposed to be? Because that's just what hasn't happened enough. There's enough teams out there that have a general manager or have front office personnel that have drafted the right guy at the right time. I think the Flyers have done that enough, actually, that they've drafted the right guy at that moment. But then what happens next? How do you give them the tools and the resources to reach the ceiling of what they were supposed to be? We've seen enough of these prospects be top guys in juniors or top guys in college or top guys, in a World Junior tournament. And then it doesn't pan out the way that you wanted it to at the NHL level. Why is that? Those are the answers that you have to have. And kind of when you're the general manager, a lot of it falls on you, whether it's your job or it's somebody else's, because you're kind of, you're building out your hockey operations department. You're a big part of that. So those are all things that kind of go into play here. And that's what makes it such a tough job. It's not a job that anybody is, going to be envious of if, for the person who gets it. You're taking on a task. It's very much like what John Tortorella is doing as the coach of a team that doesn't have expectations to make the playoffs, that has expectations to be where they are in the standings. It's not a position that many people would take on, but Tortorella wanted to take it on, and you have to hope that either Briere wants to take this on, or that there's somebody out there who does want to be the general manager of this team moving forward. If you do move on from Chuck Fletcher, which still obviously at this as we're speaking remains a question.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And that begs the other question. Is Danny being put in the best position? And that's part of his decision-making process as well. So, Chef, let me go to you.
Okay, and to go back to like where is Briere and this whole thing, and that was one question that Kevin had just brought, kind of like alluded to. He probably has more say than we all really think. I'm guessing that. He's probably got more interaction with the team and the daily duties more than so. My concern is like, yeah, right. He's basically got the Dwight Schrute role of the Flyers right now. He's the assistant to the general regional director or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's just, but my fear is this, that if Chuck either or, it doesn't matter. If Chuck gets fired or bumped up the line to president, it doesn't matter. I feel like unless Danny's got to have carte blanche, so to speak, in order to bring people he's more comfortable with in too. Maybe down the line, I look at some stuff like where we talked to with Shane Malloy before. Maybe I look at other guys in the league and say, hey, can you come in? There's got to be some mentor relationship going on here. There's got to be other people that can help, that have, let's say, maybe a little more experience or history in that upper management position, because I just don't. I mean, it's not that I don't trust him in his capabilities. I don't know what they are yet, and I'm sure, like, I know that when I was a sous chef for all those years, and then when I finally got my first chef job, I didn't realize how much I knew already. It's just I learned it by mistake, and just by daily routine. So my fear is that, though. But like, how much has he learned with Chuck? I know he was in Maine for pretty much on his own little island for a while doing stuff there. But I just think, and if we're going to look at it, I mean, is there, he needs to have that ability to say, hey, you know what? We're going to add more people in research and development stage of our thing. We have to have this. He's got to have a little bit more power and say, and we can't just say, hey, one or two guys developing players is good enough. It should be around 7 or 8, in my opinion, and that's just what I see from looking around the league in that case. So I think he needs a little bit of hey, new broom sweeps clean. Get in there, do what you got to do. If you're gonna commit to Danny Briere, and like you said, a fan favorite and all this, and we're going to assume, by what Tort said, he's a real good hockey guy. I like talking hockey with him. If we believe that maybe they're forging a relationship there, and that's going to be the tandem going forward, I have no problem with it. But I want them to be all in on Danny. I don't want to hear handcuffs. I don't want to hear the executive board saying, oh, I don't think that's the old timers got to step back and go, you know what? Let them have at it. I mean, does that sound like reasonable? I mean, to me, that sounds like very reasonable that this is something that, they should be letting to do. If you're going to go that route, then commit the whole way.
Yeah, as in letting him build his own front office staff. Exactly. And
yeah, everything. Let him build everything.
But I do also agree. There's an element of that I also agree with, which is, I don't love the idea of, essentially promoting Chuck Fletcher and saying he still is the president of the operations department. But I'm not opposed to that structure with Briere as a general manager. If you want to bring in, as you alluded to, the right mentor for him who has some history, and probably maybe the most important thing if you go that direction is a winning background, somebody who's not just built before, but built somebody who's won before. And, you know, that would be, I think it would be an ideal scenario, because I think that would also especially in the early going, it would give Briere some guidance. It would give him some resources to use, get somebody in here who has been down that road before. And listen, to an extent, they already have one of those guys to an extent, because Dean Lombardi is a senior advisor of the team as well. Yeah. And, maybe you can, but involvement of senior advisors is always a little bit of a sketchy thing, because you don't know how often they're really there, or if sometimes they are also just showing up possibly for the game portion of it, but are they doing the day-to-day? Probably not. We've kind of discussed that. So that's why I think it maybe makes more sense. Think about it. When Ron Hextall got the job in Pittsburgh and is their general manager, they also bring in Brian Burke and say, you're the president of hockey operations, which at that point in time, that's not I'm going to just guide you through. That's, I'm helping run this whole operation. So Brian Burke's fingerprints are all over everything too. So when they're having, and listen, the Flyers don't exactly have Sidney Crosby, who's hanging around, in the back, maybe in the back nine of his career, but still delivering at a high level. They don't have a player like that most people would come in and say, I'm really glad I've got a player like this. But they do have the ability to bring in to their front office and to start off of this, that kind of structure. And again, I'm not at all opposed to that possibility at all, that if you bring in the right guy who is your president of hockey operations and let Danny Briere be groomed underneath of him, because that's the thing I think that shakes my confidence the most when it comes to moving forward with Briere as GM is, how am I supposed to believe that he's ready for the job when the group that has led him to this point hasn't done theirs very well? And how am I supposed to believe that he's going to be any better if the only move that's made is, well, we'll just move Chuck Fletcher up one position. He's not the general manager anymore, but he's the president of hockey operations. Then he's still being groomed under the same guy. So it doesn't make much sense to me at all. But if you give him the right resource, and, this is not me suggesting that this is a name that would do it, or a name that is, even that they're interested in. But I just, if I look around, I sit and I go, what's, sometimes you have these thoughts. We go, what's so-and-so up to? What's this guy who I know was a builder of this team or whatever? What's he up to? And ironically, the guy who I'm thinking of works for the Minnesota Wild organization now, didn't for a long time, but a guy who I sit there and I go, you know what? Who's been part of a Stanley Cup winning organization and built Stanley Cup winning teams, and then built a team that's doing really, or at least started to build a team that's doing really well in the here and now? Ray Shero. Ray Shero won with Pittsburgh, had his fingerprints on the New Jersey Devils in the mid part of the past decade, definitely had some influence on where they are now, because they've got players who he helped get there. And it's kind of just the finishing touches, but that's a name that I kind of sit there and go, what's he up to? And I think about it because of the fact that, there is a connection, the name is associated with the Flyers organization. Ray has nothing to do with the Flyers past, but his father certainly does. And as a result of that, maybe that's a welcome thing for Flyers fans. So they go, okay, that's a name that's very synonymous with the best moment of our franchise's history. And that's a guy who's done some of these things and can maybe help get a Danny Briere into the right frame of mind to do the next steps that are necessary in this build process. Again, that's not there's no knowledge of if there's interest behind that or if that would go anywhere, but it's a name that I know, it's very similar to when Chuck Fletcher was hired. If you're just sitting out there as a senior advisor and you're in a position to potentially go back into the GM fold or take on a presidential role, I guess, it's worth possibly inquiring about, is all I would say to that. So that's the kind of thought that I would have is, is that a guy who with that background you would take a chance on and say, maybe that's the guy who can lead our new general manager with no prior history in the right direction.
Sure. That's what my whole point was about it, was everybody's out there going GM, and they don't realize there's two positions there that really have to be filled. It's the president and the GM, and it doesn't have to be the same person. I always thought that, I always thought it's better when it's not the same person, because You know, and especially in Philly, and too many times we see both situations going bad. But I really think that if you get somebody from outside to be the president and have that mentor figure for, if that's the whole route you're going to go, if you're committed to Briere, which I'm fine with, just let them grow with somebody else. I think people are forgetting, especially Flyers fans now, that it's two separate positions, and I think if they address that going forward, I think it'll make the linear thinking of it easier.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we talked about names like Mike Fuda, ex of LA, Mark Yannetti, also another guy who's in LA, and Ray Shiro did build a cup winner. And probably you could make the case they deserved a little more time with what was going on in Jersey. So, yeah, I mean, the concept is absolutely valid. The names, we could all speculate, but I agree with that completely. So, gents, we're going to move on to the final topic of the night, and that's the World Junior Championships, which, as we are recording right now, might be wrapping up the second semifinal. Earlier, the Czechs tied up Sweden with 38 seconds to go. Could have been a Flyer named David Jiricek. Tied the game with that amount to go, and what he looks like a horse out there. So they're going to be in the final versus the winner of Canada and USA. And I have a feeling one of you guys actually know the answer to that question, but I'm not going to push it. And but yeah, I mean, that's the thing about the tournament. You see your draft eligibles, guys like Connor Bedard, Fantilli, Leo Carlson from Sweden. I mean, these are, Bedard is definitely McDavid-like. And the other guys you could clearly see are a level below. But you also are looking at your top guys and you see how they look. And you can't help but make that comparison of Cutter Gauthier, who had been a little bit tentative until like the last game versus Germany. He got a couple of goals and looked better. I don't know what he's looking like tonight. And then a guy like Jiricek, who's really the BMOC. He's one of the top guys on the whole team, and he's been carrying them practically. Him and like 3 or 4 other guys, because they play a system defense. It's really smothering. And he just looks fantastic. So there's a lot to look at there. What are your impressions, Kevin, as you have caught the action at the tournament?
Well, it's one of the best tournaments that is out there, period, because there's just so much energy to it. As I'm talking to you guys, I've got the wrap up, or I'm watching the final stages, final period of the US-Canada game. So it just is an absolutely outstanding, it's been an outstanding game to this point, is as much as I'll say about it. And
well, that's up to you. I mean, you're our guest.
No. I'm not giving away any spoilers in here while it's going on. But
I've been cheating. I've been looking.
Yeah. So, but the pace is just incredible and things like that. I mean, obviously Bedard's stealing a lot of the headlines here because of just how well he's playing. I mean, these are more than just McDavid numbers at this point. I mean, what he's doing in this tournament is Gretzky-like. I mean, that's how crazy what he's doing is.
The kid is a living cheat code. He's like Contra. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you know what we're talking about when we say that. You're still a young buck, but up, down, left, right, boom. That's what I think of when I see Connor Bedard.
The funny thing is, I saw the goal that he scored to get Canada to the semis in overtime, and I just look at it and I go, that was him one night. The next night, Connor McDavid scores a great goal. And I just can't wait for the next 10, 15 years of Connor versus Connor as two of the best players in the world, maybe the two best, because that's what we're headed towards. That's what I see when I see Bedard right now. Anyway, I see a guy who's going to compete for the best player in the world eventually, because he's doing this at an age and at an experience level. Really. I mean, how many of the guys on these junior teams are already attached to a franchise? He doesn't know where he's playing next year, but he's going to find out eventually. And whoever gets him is going to be really lucky, because they're going to have a player who is above and beyond anything else in this tournament to this point. That's not to take away from the other guys who are going to go in the draft with him, because Fantilli's had a good tournament in his own right. It's just, and I think that actually the thing that hurts Fantilli more than Bedard is the presence of Shane Wright, because that kind of bumps him down the depth chart a little bit. So Fantilli's not exactly put into the most critical situations all the time or gets more ice time than, say, another guy. He's had a solid tournament. He's obviously had a very solid, start to his college career as well. So there's no arguing that he's got a place, right at the top of the draft board. Also, he's probably, to me, he's probably number 2 right after Bedard. One of those classic cases of, if it wasn't Bedard's year, he would have been an easy number 1 pick, but he's not going to be. He's going to be a number 2 because Bedard is so good. So that's just the way it is for him. But obviously, the other part of this exercise when you're watching these games and looking at players is who are the guys who are already attached to your own organization, or in my case, the organization that I cover. And, they're really, first of all, they didn't exactly have in years past, they would have a pretty high number of representation. This year, they do not. I believe it was only Cutter Gauthier and Brian Zanetti. That was the only 2. Right. So, and Zanetti was fine. I don't think there was anything that overly stood out. It's kind of, an unenviable position to be playing for a team like Switzerland when you don't have the highest of expectations, in the tournament to begin with. You're not a Team Canada. You're not a USA. You're not even on the level of Sweden, Finland, Czech Republic, that kind of stuff, or Czechia. So you're not really in those conversations. You're not at that level. But Gauthier, on the other hand, is certainly, a guy who is drawing a lot of attention. And, I think that the big thing for him is on a team that has a lot of recent draft picks, a lot of high draft picks. He's a high draft pick himself, but yet there's another guy who I believe is his line mate who was drafted 2 picks before him. And
Logan Cooley.
Yes.
Arizona? Is he with the...
Yes, Arizona. Yep. And, he's right in there with it. It took him a while to score goal-wise. He has points throughout the whole tournament. I think he's been pretty consistent with that. But it took him a while to get the goals. I believe it wasn't until the last game they played, the quarterfinal game, when he scored 2. And it was, okay, now you got something. Now he's finally finding the net a little bit more. But overall, I think going into the game against Canada, he played 5 games and had 8 points. And that's nothing to, just let go by the wayside here just because you're not in the same stratosphere as Bedard. He's having a real, and I got to double it up and couple it with his college numbers so far because, he's played 13 games at college, which when I looked at, I kind of took a look at the college statistics, just across the entire NCAA. And, he's got to be one of the players who has the fewest number of games played among some of these college kids. He's got 13 games, and where other guys, I think I saw that, I believe it was Cooley has the same number of goals as Gauthier does in the college season anyway, 10. And Cooley's played something like 5 or 6 games more than Gauthier has. So it kind of shows you that Gautier's got some goal scoring chops, for the limited number of games he's played to be up to 10, to do some things that, there have been highlights that have floated around, and he's got some skill. He's got some ability to make a move and make a play and have some game changing ability. So you do start to think about that. I still kind of pump the brakes on him, not in the sense that I don't think he's a high talent. I do. I don't know that I would start running and look at his college numbers and look at the way that he's played at the, at the junior level here at the junior tournament. I don't, look at that and say, maybe don't rush him into the pro. I think there's some people who are starting to think, what if he goes pro after the season like he said he wanted to? Yeah, I still think you kind of try to pump the brakes there a little bit. I have a feeling that that's not the way it's going to play out. I have a feeling that he's going to kind of make the decision. I still would be cautious with him moving forward, just in terms of let him develop. I think that, if he does sign out of college this year when his season's over and goes to the Phantoms for a little bit and gets some time, there's, he's got the ability, he's got the right to make that decision for how he wants his future to go if he thinks he's ready for that. But I just hope that the team kind of goes, almost as John Tortorella said, that, goes with that Cam York approach.
Yeah.
Leave him down there to marinate a little bit. Let's see what he looks like at the pro level before anything else happens. But certainly he's made a very good first impression, an early impression. And I think that that's something that you absolutely have to be excited about. If you're a Flyers fan right now, you have to be excited about the fact that there is a guy who, at least at those ranks, is standing out at the, he's having moments where he stands out at World Juniors. He's definitely standing out at the college level, and we'll see what's next.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I don't think you should let the player dictate in this particular fashion. He's a number 5 overall draft pick, and it just seems like the kind of guy, if you wait another year with this guy, let him get stronger, especially with that college schedule where they don't play as many games. I could see him going in the AHL next year, and he's not he's not the big man anymore. He's running into men who are in some cases are going to be like 10, 12 years older than him that have real man strength. And I know that the schedule is good for development. You don't have a lot of weeknight games, but it's just a little more patience. And it seems to be something that the Flyers are doing a little bit better job of trying to emphasize with these guys. But it does seem during this tournament that, to me, it's just my eyes, he has the game that's more of a straight line game. His 2 line mates in Snuggerud and Cooley seem to be more comfortable in the offensive zone with east-west play. So there's a little bit more of dynamism there. He seems more like a Jeff Carter type north-south kind of player. And there are guys that have been successful. It's kind of the exception, not the rule in his case. So I'd like to give him a little more time to grow into his body, improve his skating, get a little stronger. I mean, he's going to succeed in the NHL by playing a game in the toughest areas. And I would want him to get a little stronger. But that's just me, Chef.
No, you're right. Because if like timeline speaking, let's just say he comes in, he does turn pro, and let's say he does 25, 30 games, and he comes in after the new year next year around this time, or maybe a week or two. He's going to need to have that wall work. He's going to be the need to have that extra strength to him, because that's the kind of game that Torts is looking at. That's that. If you're going to if you look at this team going forward, you have to consider the coach and who you draft and who's coming up and all that, because he is the one ultimately making decisions of whether or not they're part of his future or not. And like I've said it once, and I'll say it probably twice now, 2-3 times. The guys aren't playing for a job on the team this year. They're playing for a job on the team next year. When you're looking at expiring contracts, you got a lot of guys that, and there's a lot of the younger, the junior, AHL contracts that are up for renewal or expiration. And you're going to see that some of these guys, they're going to pull the Band-Aid off and move on, because if they can get better contracts and sign younger kids TLCs and see what their future holds, because there's a couple guys down there, Ratcliffe and Lixell. I know he's looked better, but you gotta. It's either they're part of the future or not part of the future, and that decision is getting made this year.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Yeah, these are the tough decisions that are going to have to be made. Before we let you go, Kev, as we wrap, any other players catch your eye, like some of the guys I talked about, like Leo Carlson, Sandy Pelika, the defenseman who's on Sweden, who's Carlson's teammate, or maybe some of these Slovakian players that are good, or Czechia players that they're draft eligible?
I did keep an eye on Carlson, because I'm kind of, you're focusing on the names that are kind of towards that top 10 projected kind of area. And look, Bedard is the sweepstakes, no doubt about it. But if you can get somewhere else in the top 5, you're starting to consider some of the other names. And we've talked about the trio that's going to probably go at the top 3, but Carlson's probably your 4 at this point, I would say, where it seems like that's a projection that's out there a lot, is that he might be number 4. And I thought he had a decent tournament. I mean, it was, I was a little bit surprised at, some of the results in this tournament have been a little surprising, because, I think both of the powerhouse teams that you would expect to be, bringing some of the most talent in Canada and the US, both got humbled at one point in the tournament, so right. It was, certainly that's a big part of everything. And then, to be honest, when I was getting the, we already mentioned who won the first semifinal game there, Sweden was right there. It was there for the taking, and it's right there. And you kind of expect that, because Sweden's been a team that gets pretty far in these tournaments of late, and they're going to be playing for a bronze medal because of it, because of the way it goes at the end. And, but I thought that, but I did think that Carlson was a good player for them throughout. Felt like every time, in a lot of games when I went and looked at the because I didn't get to watch every single minute of every single game, but if I go back and check some of the recaps of the stat sheets or anything like that, his name would be on there multiple times. So he definitely had a strong production tournament to say the least. So I'm interested in guys like that who are probably going to be near the top, and certainly going to just continue to keep an eye on guys like that as we get closer to the end of the year and we start to find out when, and I'm sure we'll probably talk again before that, because we got a whole half of the season still to go before we get anywhere close to draft stuff. But it's still worth keeping an eye on as we go through. I think just for the fun of it, and again, there's no guarantees to who gets Bedard when it comes down to it. But for fun, pretty much every week, I think I go back in and I just check to see, what's the total up to in juniors for him, because, outside of this tournament, because he's just having one incredible season. It's kind of, again, it kind of goes back to the McDavid Bedard thing. It's kind of fun to watch him be the best player at the junior level and McDavid be the best player at the NHL level, and watch the two of them go up against each other in terms of games played, point totals, who's doing what on a given night, because it just seems to be that that they're both just at the highest level possible, and it's incredible stuff to watch. It's been great fun, and certainly when Bedard scored that goal in overtime, for example, it was like the least shocking thing in the world that he's the guy at the center of all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Chef, you get the last question of the night.
Okay, here's my last question. I guess I'll pose it to both of you. Okay, suppose, all right, by some miracle, the Flyers end up with the second pick in the lottery. All right, who do you think that they? Obviously, I mean, who do you think they should take? But if they don't get that second pick, who do you think they actually end up with in the top 7, 8? Kevin?
The first one's an easy one to me. I mean, the first question you asked is easy. If I'm the one holding the second pick, I'm probably taking Fantilli.
Definitely.
That's where I am right now. The second one is not as easy because too much can change among that group. Like, I feel like we're, again, it's that top 3 and then a bunch of players that could fall in line. So that's a question. That's a question.
Gut feeling. Who do you think they end up with then?
So I'll play it this way, because I look at the standings today and I still see, as much as they're playing competitively, they've won some games against the lower teams, and some of those teams still have extra games against them, or, it's not impossible for teams to make up 4 points. I think Chicago and Anaheim and Columbus have probably, that ship has probably sailed at this point. You're looking at an 11-point gap, but the 4-point gap's not so much. So, I could see them looking, if, like, let's say they end up in 4th, I could see them going Carlson there. I really could. And, from there, I'd have to do a lot more digging to figure out who I feel would be the ideal 5th, 6th, 7th versus what's out there. There's a lot of, there's going to be a lot more projections than before, than there are now as we get through the next few months. So that's kind of where I'll leave that for now. But certainly, it's an absolutely easy question if they end up with 2.
2 is easy, yeah.
I think 2 and 3 and 4 might be easy at this point. I mean, I don't want to speak for 4 completely. There's time for that to change, but I think that if they even end up with 3, I think it would be pretty easy to go with Michkov.
Well, even Michkov, though, I mean, the situation in Russia and Ukraine, you don't think that affects him? You don't think he drops a little bit lower because of that?
That's possible.
He's under contract for until 26.
He is. That would be more of a thing, and that was probably more of a reason why I'm still okay with it, because what his future holds, and he's got a couple years of that before you can bring him up here. So I think that there would be time. I think what happened with Ivan Fedotov this year and all that type of stuff was kind of a perfect storm of the situation over there. Going with when the player was supposed to come over here, kind of thing. I think that was just, it's the timing of it. But I think given the fact that there's more knowledge about Mishkov's current situation and being under contract over there, I don't know that anybody's going to shy away from it right now. And he's, but I do think that that could be a big separator between 2 and 3, if I'm being honest. That you're watching, Fantilli's playing at Michigan this year. You're watching him do what he's doing at University of Michigan. You're going, okay, that's a guy who I think is the next best player beyond Bedard. I think that'd be a simple way to look at it for sure. So, you know, that's really, you know, and I'll like I said, I'll dive way more into some of that stuff as it gets closer because, you know, there's going to be a lot of focus on that draft, you know, wherever they end up, you know, and it's kind of hard to gauge where they're going to truly end up because, you know, like I sit there and I look at it and I go, the way that one of the best ways I can see it is that they would have, you know, they probably won't get the third pick because I could see them finish, you know, if they finish fourth, they would have the shot at first or second, and then fourth, fifth, and sixth is always on the table too at that point. You know, we can only continue to drive that number up as things go. 1 and 2 is possible. I assume that 5 is probably going to be possible. And then 5, 6, and 7 is a good range to start looking at. But, you know, I'm going to keep 4 on the table as well because you never know. I
think they're going to end up with Braden Yeager. I just think, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's something they need, but it's for some odd reason, it's a gut feeling. I look at it and go, if the season shakes out the way it does right now, they could possibly get that. So,
well, hit your draft guides. I have to confess, I've only heard the name. I really don't know much about the player. But there are 3 things, and then we'll call it a wrap. 1, I think Fantilli would be the pick if they got number 2. As things stand now, I don't think enough is going to change. But if they get like a pick in that range of like 4 to 7, this is the type of scenario with the quality and the tier down where the next half of the season could make a big difference, like Kevin was saying, in terms of who rises and who might fall. Yep. And the Flyers, and much of their scouting staff has remained the same. They have had the tendency to go with the riser. They did that with Sanheim. They did that with Cutter Gauthier. And I'm sure Kevin could probably take out a couple names. If players are improving as the season goes on in their draft year, they tend to do that. And the final thing I just wanted to say is that, listen, they, in 2007, they were by far the worst team, and they kind of got cheated out of a Hall of Fame with Pat Kane because, you know, it was all about the lottery. And then 10 years later, they got lucky and they got the number 2 overall pick, and the best guy in the draft went to Colorado, who essentially rode that pick to the Stanley Cup. So we whiffed with Nolan Patrick, a guy who's injury prone and didn't look like he ever wanted to be here. So you just don't know. Yeah, I think we got to have faith in what Tortorella's doing and hope that we get a general manager that can manage. Manage, do your job. You have one job. Anyway, Kevin, thanks so much. Let's get your contact information and anything that you're involved in right now that you want the people to know about.
Sure. So pretty much the usual over at 97.3 ESPN, covering all of the games, giving, you know, anything else I can give over there. You know, the last thing I did on air was the state of the teams. I've, you know, mentioned on that I think I've written 1 piece a month regarding management. If you average it out anyway, sometimes scattered, maybe 2 a month, maybe none, but it averaged out over the last year to 1 a month. I can tell you that. Also over at sportstalkphilly.com as well. The You Would Think podcast, which will be back for the first episode in probably about 3 weeks. Actually, for a good stretch of time, we joked that we were going to come back in the immediate if something happened, and we've said that twice this year, and nothing in the immediate has happened. So we had taken a couple weeks off for the holidays. We're going to come back and do our next and latest episode we'll record it on Sunday. It'll be up Sunday night, Monday morning-ish kind of stuff this upcoming week. So you can look out for that. I'm over on Twitter at Kevin_Durso. The YWT podcast is at YWT podcast on Twitter. Just all that type of stuff. And, you know, again, thanks for having me, guys. Always appreciate it. And looking forward to talking to you again sometime down the road.
Fantastic, Kevin. It's always a pleasure to have you aboard. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Right. Take care. Okay. So, Chef, we're going to make a quick exit here because we've had a pretty long show. I think we've covered a lot of territory people want us to cover. People want to know what Kevin's opinion is. He's down there. He's covering this team, so he's got his finger on the pulse. So why don't you give him any final thoughts and your contact info?
Oh yeah, I think I look forward. I think I'm gonna get down to a game after the New Year here there myself, at least 2 or 3 of them, and I'll meet up with Kevin down there and see what we compare notes. But yes, if you probably have some disagreements of what I've said in this past show or what any of us had said, hey man, reach out to it. You can reach me at Chef to Left B on Twitter, Chef the number 2 the left B, and you can reach me there, and I will gladly interact with you.
You got it. And you can follow me, Isaiah, ISAIAH_520. Isaiah, don't forget the _520. It's an account that covers some other stuff. And if you don't like some of that stuff, which is okay, we're all individuals, and that's a great thing. You can follow the O&B Puckcast at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. So we'll come back to see you in about 4 to 6 or 7 games. And hopefully Dan will be back having won the poker tournament. And we'll talk about that at that time. But until then, everybody, take care.